Hey guys, sorry it's taking me so long to get to this video, but let's just dive right into it. I haven't done any preparations for this, which I thought was kind of a downside, but at the same time, I think it might actually be a good thing since I can show you guys literally just my workflow process on how I figured out how to get the CI/CD or continuous deployment set up for my project as like a beginner working with Google Cloud. So let's just get right into it. I mean, we start off here at the Google Cloud Console. Um, you'll need to have billing enabled and some projects. So here I have this project, we'll call it Streamlit. It's the one I've been using for a while now. If you need help on setting up a Google Billing account or a Google Cloud account, there's a ton of resources available. I mean, we can look one up right now. Set up Google Cloud Billing account. Yeah, Google Cloud's got a ton of documentation on the process of how to do this. Otherwise, there's a ton of YouTube videos on it too. Um, in this case, I just have this sample GitHub. It's like a repo, I guess. There's nothing in it, but I just thought I'd use this as an example for getting set up with continuous deployment. So here we are at the dashboard. I'm assuming in Cloud Run you'll have some application already deployed. There's this one, Streamlit, which I've been using. Right now it's down, but we'll just go with it. It looked like it failed to start, but that shouldn't matter. So you'll come here and you'll have your service. Let's go back. So yeah, inside of Cloud Run, you'll have your service. I'm assuming it's up and running. You've got it deployed locally from your computer up to Google Cloud Run. Now you're trying to get it to have continuous deployment. If you don't know what continuous deployment is, for those who are new to the concept, continuous deployment is having your code or your application ideally Dockerized or containerized in some transportable form and on GitHub or some other source repository. You can also use Google Cloud like containers, container registry. That's right. I referenced it in my previous Medium blog. Actually, I'm using container registry. I believe it was my previous Medium blog, or it was my other YouTube video. The other YouTube video on, I think it was the YouTube video on building and deploying um, your your machine learning web apps using Google Cloud Run. I think I talked about container registry a little bit there. But yeah, you can use container registry as an alternative to GitHub. Instead of hosting your code or your application on GitHub, you can host it on container registry or store it on the container registry, and then you can link to it from the container registry to here. In my case, I just used GitHub. I mean, my code's already on there. A lot of the case, you'll put your code on GitHub anyway. You'll want to store it somewhere, so it kind of kills two birds with one stone. Container registry, you wouldn't really use it for anything else. So in my case, I went with GitHub. So diving back into this, once your service is up and running, ignore this sign. In your case, this would have to be running for it to work. If it's not running, refer back to my other video on getting it deployed using Google Cloud Run. There you'll see all the information on how to get it up and running. But now you're up and running, so you can select Edit Continuous Deployment over here, and you'll be prompted to this section, Editing Your Trigger. So this name doesn't really matter, but you can change it to something that you're able to keep track of. You can say like trigger 1 if you want or something. We'll just leave it as it is for now. Region, you can leave this as it is. Description, you can also leave this as it is. Tags, event. So what this does is this triggers when it builds a new version of your application. And here you can choose what triggers that new build, what event triggers. So pushing to a new branch is what I go with. And what that means is with every update, every new push you create here. So if I say I went to this README, for example, and I said, I just made a change and say like, hope you enjoy the product. And I go and commit this change. That commit, that push, would then trigger a new build, and that new build would literally once you do that, it would automatically start building a new version of your app, And that's the cool thing about continuous deployment is, say you have Visual Studio VS Code available and it's connected to your GitHub repo. You can make your changes in your terminal, push it to GitHub, and the continuous deployment would do all the rest. You wouldn't have to worry about it. Really, really cool. So yeah, I would select push to a new branch, or in response to, you can leave this blank, source repository. Now here's where you're going to connect it to your particular GitHub repo. So I have this. I'm actually going to connect a new one. Select source, GitHub, cloud build, GitHub app. Build source code in response to pull requests and pushes. I think that's what we want, actually. I don't have GitHub Enterprise, but I think it's this one. We can do, let's just check. Build source code in response to pushes mirrored through cloud source repositories. I think it's this one. We'll go with this one. I might be wrong. Either way, we'll figure it out at the end of this. So hit continue. Failed to open the pop-up. Oh, I must have to activate this. Okay. Well, let's try that again. Okay. Authenticate. So I think that pop-up, what it does is you just have to log into GitHub. So I have an organization connected to my GitHub. In your case, maybe you have an organization. If so, that's one of the cool advantages is you can keep the abstraction level, so that if say you have repositories with your organization, you don't have to connect your personal GitHub. You can connect the organization's repositories through your own login, which is really cool. But in my case, we'll stick with mine right here, Fazy676. That's me. Repository. Let's see, this one right here, sub X. That's this one. So we'll go ahead and click OK. We'll go ahead and check that we understand this. We'll connect that. And so now we've connected that, and it's on master branch, I believe. Actually, I think I'm wrong. Main right here. It's on main branch. So we'll go here. We'll change that to main. Boom. And then let's see what's next. Matches the branch. Main configuration. These two are probably the most important you're going to need to look at is a cloud build configuration file. That's usually in the format. Let me open a text edit. A new document. It's titled, you'd call it clouds build. Cloud build dot YAML file. This should be one word and all lowercase. Oh my god, sorry about that. Yeah, cloudbuild.yaml is what it would be titled, and you would have a cloudbuild.yaml file in your repository. Actually, I'll just delete that. Yeah, so you would have one of those in here, and if you have one of those, you would check this. If your container is Dockerized, using Docker, you would select one of these. I personally use Docker, so I selected Docker file. However, there's going to be some advantages to using a cloud build configuration file, which I'll dive into once we go through this. It's not in all use cases, but it's in one particular use case that I found, my particular use case, which I'll dive into. But most of the time, Docker should work for you. And your Docker file directory, you can just put root. Root should work just right here. And you can label the Docker file name. Also, auto detect also works if you have a Docker file and no cloud build YAML file. You can also check auto detect, and it will fill in all these values for you, so you won't have to worry about that. And here's your location of the repository. Advanced approval, require approval before build executes. So this just makes sure that you don't have to, so it doesn't do it automatically. But I didn't check this in my case. I wanted it to build no matter what push I make. Just make sure it's quick. Build logs, so you could send the build logs to GitHub. That's pretty cool. I didn't check that personally. And service account email, so you won't have to do that, I don't think. So in this case, I would hit save, and it would start building that trigger, and it would create the trigger and start building the new what do you call it? Deploying the application from GitHub. I'm so sorry. My brain's, I don't know where it's at tonight. So there's our Docker file trigger. These are some previous triggers that I created. This one's a Docker file trigger. I named it that. which triggers from the Docker file basically, and then I created a separate one which is, I call this YAML file trigger, which is triggered. It uses, I specified the cloud build YAML file as the like what I showed you before. I can actually open this up. Here you see I've specified Docker file specifically for this one trigger I was testing, and here in YAML file I selected the cloud build configuration file. Honestly, that's about it for setting up continuous deployment. In my case, it's pretty simple, pretty straightforward, self-explanatory. Now I'll dive into some of the nitty-gritty things and those use cases that I was talking about. So the reason why it took me so long to make this video was because I kept getting hung up on this error that made actually setting up continuous deployment kind of annoying. And I'm actually going to ask for you guys to help me out with this. When I try to build a trigger, here's this Docker file trigger, for example, I get a timeout. So it takes time for that trigger to run. I can actually show you guys. So history. So here you can see a couple of times I tried to build. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. Most of the times it didn't. And you can see it takes very long time. In my case, because there's a 5 GB file that needs to be downloaded and then connected to my app. So the larger the file, naturally the longer it'll take. Here's 44 minutes, 39 minutes, basically 40 minutes. It takes a while. And normally the default duration is 20 minutes. And if your file is bigger than say, like if your file is like 5 GB or so, like my case, or your repository, ultimately your app has larger files in it, it's going to take a long time and it's going to time out. And the problem I had was trying to figure out how to stop the timeout, or get a timeout long enough that it works, and it doesn't stop building and it fails to build. I'll go through some of the things I did. So in one thing I noticed, where if you select Docker file, you can specify a timeout down here. You can see here the default timeout is 10 minutes, and here you have 3,000 seconds, or I specified that, which is 3,000 divided by 60 is like 50 minutes, so like an hour, give or take. And I think you can specify up to 3,600. I could be wrong, or actually I think it might even be 24 hours. You can check actually in, what is this called? Cloud build timeout and build configuration file schema. Let's see, timeout. I might not find it. If so, I'll just leave it to you guys. But I know I read somewhere it's like a default of about 24 hours. Use a timeout field. Use the timeout field to specify the timeout must be allowed to run. If timeout is not set, a default timeout of 10 minutes will apply to the build. Okay, the maximum value that can be applied to timeout is 24 hours. Okay, yeah, that's what I was referring to. And what does this refer to? This refers to build configuration file schemas. Okay, so I'm assuming that also holds true to this timeout specification, because one thing to note is, even if you select Docker file as your trigger, a Docker file as your trigger, it's going to create a cloud build YAML file regardless. And there, I think that timeout that you specify will be loaded into that cloud build.yaml file, which then brings us to the cloud build.yaml file approach. So I created a separate trigger where I used the cloud build YAML file. I created one, put it in the repository, selected this, gave it the name cloud build.yaml, and inside here I selected, or I created, let me see how I can specify the timeout. Actually, I might even have to go over to the repository. Actually, I don't want to do that. There's some important stuff in there. I can show you guys one. So if I come in here, okay, so inside configuration, it selects cloud build configuration file. so like I said, even if you click Docker file, it's going to create a cloud build configuration file anyway, based off of the specifications in your Docker file. And then that trigger is going to default to this anyway. It's going to use the cloud build configuration file that is built off of your Docker file. And you can view that later on after you've created the trigger. I'm going to move this over here. But yeah, here you can see it uses my Docker file. You can see some of the commands it runs in here. You can also see that I specified timeouts, right? A timeout of 2,500 seconds for this. And so you can also specify the timeout in the cloud build configuration file. So these are two ways to specify the timeout if your application takes a while to build. For information on how to format that, actually, because one of the things I was wondering was, I need to specify the timeout. Where do I write it? I could dive into it. For example, like each step has a name, and for each step you can specify the timeout for that step. So this name or this ID for the step is build. So for the build step, it'll be that a timeout of 2,500 seconds. This step is called push. I'll specify a timeout there. Same for the step called deploy. And then ultimately I'll specify a timeout for all the steps, like a default timeout out here. You can see that in this here, the build configuration file schema, where I search timeout. They show examples of where to put the timeout. For example, you see there steps. Here's the name of the step, ID of the step, and you can put in the timeout for the step. And then like I showed over there, you can have a timeout for in the same line as the steps for all the steps. It's a lot of steps. Sorry for that. But yeah, so I tried both of these, and regardless, it still seemed to time out. I don't really know how to get a timeout beyond say 44 minutes, because I specified, let's see here, there was one time I specified a timeout of 3,500 seconds, which was around 58 minutes 33 seconds. Let's see if I can find that down here somewhere. I might not be able to, but oh yeah, it was here, 53 seconds. We can view that trigger too. So if we come here, let's see what did I specify for that? 2,500 seconds. What's that? 2,500 60. It's a 41 minutes. I think I changed it here, but before it was let's see, what's 53 times 60. I think I specified 3,200 for that. It was a 3,200 timeout. So sometimes, for example, this one, I specified that same 3,200 timeout, and it still would get hung up on, like, it would still get timed out. So that's where I'll leave it to you guys. This particular issue, if you guys can figure out how to get the timeout working for like an extended period of time, that would be great. Let me know in the comments. I would really appreciate it. If you guys do, I'll highlight it and I'll make a video on it. But otherwise, other than that issue, the process of setting up continuous deployment is relatively simple and straightforward. It's just like I showed in this video. Yeah, good luck. I hope that helps you guys. If I missed something or there's more information that needs clarification, let me know as well in the comments, and if pertinent, I'll make a video on it. Otherwise, I'll just make a blog on it, and I'll link it in the description of this video, so you can refer to that in the future. Otherwise, there you go, guys. Thanks for your patience.